Good afternoon or good evening. Today I'm going to be talking about a few things. First off, I want to talk about obviously something that everyone's seen happen or has heard about. I personally, thankfully, have not seen the actual event or the imagery that came out of it. Obviously, I'm talking about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. But however, I have seen I'll call it procession that has happened with his so-called funeral, or his celebration of life, as people now like to say. And unfortunately, it's very emblematic of the state of our country. I'll get a little bit more into that in a moment, but basically, if you saw it, it was a promotion essentially for not only Turn Point USA, but this milquetoast conservatism and baseline evangelical Christianity, not like anything different from, I would say, early 2000s, Americans. It's essentially a pivot back to the status quo, despite the fact that there's been so much happening and people have been waking up to reality and, understanding the world they live in a little bit more and the history of it and how important it is. But it was basically used as a big show off of stuff, which is very deplorable. But also, people around the country, notably, have been doing stuff like vigils and whatnot. Okay, I get it. People do vigils when people die. But the way that they've been doing stuff for him makes me recall something that happened several years ago. The George Floyd incident, when he died in police custody. Some people say it's because of police brutality, others because it's a overdose. I'm not going to really touch on that. That's not the point of the video. But in many ways, that became a very large-scale international incident, and people started to, make murals, put vigils up, essentially venerated him. And that's the same way that it's going on right now with Charlie Kirk's passing. They're being in a state of essentially venerating him, which is very interesting because if you all are aware of history or even modern times, America, specifically Protestantism in America, doesn't exactly recognize saints or sainthood as being a thing. They actually deplore that. Religiously, they think it's abhorrent, which is crazy, because people just misunderstand the entire concept of what saints are. And then they'll be like, oh, I need you to pray for me because I know, you're such and such. Like they'll ask like their grandmother or something, thinking that, oh, because they're a wise and, I guess more moral person. I don't necessarily know, what each person's thought is behind the situation, but they understand that someone who is more moral and wise will have more of an effect within the realm of like prayer and whatnot on them, which, that's okay. But then like veneration of a saint and like use of icons are somehow heretical and disgusting to Protestants and the theology that was created from the Reformation. But anyway, that's not also for today's video. That's something I'm going to get into at a later point. Anyways, I'm going to be starting a new, mini-series. It's going to be essentially regarding the West and the lead up historically from the foundations of like civilization, like Western-based civilization, into now with the nihilist states and the nihilist empires that essentially are control of the course of history. So first we'll get into it. So what is a state? What is a nation? So historically, the concept of a state was created around the Enlightenment era. Most people who know about the Enlightenment would tell you, oh, it's a time of, great idea discovery and like rationalization becoming the main driver of thought, and like scholasticism is like super important, and individualism. Like they'll tell you just like a plethora of things of like the human mind essentially being the greatest thing that can exist, and all the assets of that becoming what gets studied and, I guess, focused on within the Enlightenment. Notably, most major revolutions, like societal revolutions, came out of the Enlightenment. For example, the French Revolution was a product of the Enlightenment. The year of revolutions, spring of revolutions, whatever term you want to use for it, in 1848, like all throughout Europe. There's revolutions by all these new minorities that were, learning about nationalism now at the time. So like the Austrian Empire, all its large minority populations were rising up, trying to create their own nations, whatnot, or demand some sort of equality, representation, whatever kind of things they're fighting for. Notably, the Hungarian Revolution. That was the biggest one within the Austrian Empire and within Europe at the time. And then even further on, you have the Decembrist Revolution, which was a failed uprising in Russia. And then you had the Bolshevik Revolution, ultimately being the culmination of the Enlightenment. The French Revolution is kind of a proto-example of communism, based on like what happened to the French society. But again, that's not what I'm going to get into today. So yeah, Enlightenment is kind of what created the concept of a state. Before statehood was a thing, we had nations. So nations are rooted on like a shared heritage. They have a, state potentially, but they also have different things that express their identity besides like the bureaucracy or geography. And they'll probably have a unified founding myth, or like mythology or ancestry. They might have the same, or typically have the same religion, or what they worship is the same gods, speaking within the ancient world, or God. There were a few monotheistic cultures at that time in the ancient world, and then also obviously culture and practices, typically language too. It's going to be the same. But yeah, so a heterogeneous society essentially is not exemplary of a nation. A homogeneous society is exemplary of a nation. Think of it today. You could look at like Saudi Arabia. That is a nation. They have a king that rules them. They're all Arabs. They all are Sunni Muslim. They kind of live, even though they're pretty wealthy for the most part, at least the king is and the royal family, they kind of live still in the Arabian tribal way that they used to centuries ago, since like Arabs existed. But then like a state, that would be something per se, like France, for example. It has a set geographic border. It has a set like government institution, notably a republic. It's recognized by others as its own state, which ironically nations don't necessarily have to be recognized because their authority and worldview does not come from a worldly basis. Nations are more often than not oriented on a divine rule, like authority is from God, and the society itself is a lot more religious and based on the natural order rather than a man-made concept of order and hierarchy. But then also states don't necessarily have to have a similar tongue, ethnicity, or like religion within their borders. So now we'll move on a little bit more. So states, also countries, either term works, are typically law-based concepts. So they have a bureaucracy that runs the system, and their law is kind of the thing that defines them. So like a constitution, it's a form of law, essentially. That is what defines, say, the U.S., because obviously we have very many different religious practices that can be practiced within the U.S., but then also a lot of different ethnicities, languages are spoken as well. Whereas for a nation, they would all, belong to a common mythos, whether it be cultural, spiritual, or otherwise. Now, okay, we've talked about this. What transcends this, though? And why am I talking about nation versus a state? So the thing that transcends this, first off, is Rome. Rome being the thing that everyone looked up to within Europe for their basis of civilization. Essentially, the pinnacle of Western civilization is the concept of copy in Rome. Most notably, Rome was not a nation nor a state, even though it existed before the Enlightenment. You might think because of what I said, it can't be a state, But notably, it is the first instance of what is like a state. First, as a nation with its early days as being a monarchy, it's united within the area of Latium, and it's like the immediate area of Rome, and then like down to maybe Capua, and then up maybe to Pisa, roughly, or Siena, I'd say. Not too large of an area, frankly. But them and the other Latins are what make up the identity of Rome. They had initially a found-in patrician stock. You can believe or disbelieve the myth of they were Trojans who fled after the destruction and razing of the city of Troy. That is what the Aeneid says, and that is what the Romans claim, is that they are the legacy and descendants of the Trojans. A lot of other people believe they simply just were Latins in the area that were kind of changing their tune. But yeah, there's that. The early days of them being a monarchy, then them transforming into a republic, an early republic. At the end of the kingdom, frankly, they had started already shifting away from the concept of what being a nation was, because they had other people, what they would call barbarians, typically within Roman history or Greek history, frankly. Anyone who's not of that people group, the culture, is called a barbarian. So I might use that term a lot when it comes to that stuff. But yeah, like they had all these other barbarians. So in this case, Celts. Most notably, most of Europe at this point was Celtic. Celtic is the proper way to pronounce it. Celtic is just a basketball team. Celtic is the actual historical term for the culture and people. This spread out all across Europe, literally the British Isles, all the way down to like the southern tip of Spain, and then all the way eastwards from the westernmost coast of modern-day France to the shores of the Danube, close to Greece, all Celtic. And also northern Italy, what wasn't owned by the Latins or the Greeks in the southern part. But yeah, Europe was a Celtic civilization. So mud huts and tribes and naked people with tattoos of blue paint on them running around. Literally not a civilization, just, goofy. But anyway, after they move into the early republic, while they're still a nation, and they're still encompassed mostly within the geographical area of the Italian peninsula, they start encompassing more groups. So like they move further south initially. They conquer all the other Latin groups. Um, they defeat the Etruscans, conquer northwards a bit. They come into contact with the Celts, and south they come into contact with the Greeks. They start, doing incursions, wars, start acquiring more land, so on and so forth. They have the whole Punic Wars, and they have the whole conquest of Gaul, Hispania, all the stuff that goes on prior to the late Republic times with Caesar and Pompey and Crassus. The 0th triumvirate is what it's typically called. And so by the time you get to that, it's the late Republic. It's technically a state already, because it is a large territory that is technically fixed to a set of borders. Although they're still expanding, they mostly have the same borders. They've been allowing client kings to be their kind of way of maintaining those. While they still have like the Roman identity as their ethnicity mainly, they've increasingly stopped like lessening the, I guess, status of other groups like Greeks and whatnot. Notably within the late Republic time, they allow other groups into the Senate, which was always a patrician thing, is that they would have like Gauls in the Senate now. And anyway, further on, I don't want to get too into detail because this part's not really that important, but you go all the way then to 212 AD. The Edict of Caracalla is issued, and in 212, the empire's borders are roughly at its pinnacle. They came to their height under Trajan, but that's not too big of a deal. Like the areas lost weren't really integral or whatever. But at this point in 212 AD, when the edict is issued, everyone that was within the empire became a citizen. So you had Britons, Gauls, Celts, Germans, barbarians, if you would, Greeks, Illyrians, Dacians, or Dacians, however you want to pronounce it, Hispanians, which were mostly also Celtic, but now kind of a fused Celtic-Roman hybrid, Syrians, Berbers, Arabs, Anatolians. So Anatolians would be like Cappadocians or Pontic, Armenians, Hebrews, Egyptians, very, very many people. They all have very many different religions. The piece for this is that they all have to, defer or pay homage to the Roman pantheon. Even the, Hebrews have to do this too. So that's like more of it being a state, especially now that they have all these citizens and it's like not a unified ethnic system. It's very, very diverse, essentially. They all have different tongues. Sure, Latin is the lingua franca, but, local goes local. Same with religion, same with, governance. Governance, sure, the civil body and jurisdiction is presided by Roman law, but that's like the only unifier aside from the lingua franca and the borders. So this is very much a state. It becomes a civilization after Christianity becomes accepted and then ultimately made the official religion. So accepted by Constantine after he defeats his rivals within the awful tetrarchy system. And then later down the line, Theodosius I makes it the official state religion. Yeah, I don't think I really need to get into that too much. But, what was I going to say? Yeah, at this point, after Christianity is kind of accepted, it's no longer just a state. It's become a civilization because it has the requirements of a state. And obviously, it's an empire, so it has the imperial institutions as well. But it now has a common unifying spiritual mythos, which gives it this civilizational status of, other previous civilizations. So like you had the Greeks, their philosophy and oration, that was like kind of their signifying peace. Or you had, let's say, the Babylonians, they had their own thing, like their building capabilities or their music or poetry, writing, whatever, stuff that like transcends the fact that it is a multi-ethnic empire, and is able to unify the people groups within it. And ultimately, within a civilization that still has a mystic, when I say mystic, I mean like not purely like rational and based on legal thought, a mystic understanding of the world. So, a divine ordering of things, and nature encompasses divinity, authorities handed by God and stuff like that. So that's what makes it kind of a civilization. And as you go on, in time, West falls, whatever, East continues to stand as a bastion of civilization and Christianity for another 1,000 years until Constantinople falls in 1453. But once again, I don't want to jump around too much, but basically Rome became the epitome of civilization and idealization for how to construct a nation and then further a state down the line in historical terms. Obviously, you had the Holy Roman Empire, which was created by initially the Franks under Charlemagne, and then later the Germans with the Ottonian dynasty in the 10th century. But once again, that was basically just them trying to imitate the Roman structure of civilization. And this would continue, the Holy Roman Empire continued for a long time. But those institutions and concepts and ideals would continue on basically until its end in some form. And then it also existed in the Tsardom of Russia until that also then collapsed. I guess was overthrown by the Soviet Union. Fell to revolutions. So that's kind of what I'm going to get into on the next video is, you have these states now in modern times. You had nations back then, but why did the change happen? What is up with the civilizations that we have now, which can't really, equal that of Roman civilization, and also are just decaying. As a lot of people know, Western civilization is kind of just like falling apart, being overrun and destroyed, both from inside and out. And I will get into that a little bit more. Obviously, the external factors you can pontificate and find on your own, but the reasons for why it's internally dead and decayed, I will get into next. That's mostly going to be starting with, I guess, the timeline of the church, because I would say the first instance of the nail in the coffin is the schism between the East and the West. Like the actual Great Schism that happened in 1054, not necessarily talking about the tiny schisms where, there's spats between entourages or the embassies, within areas, specifically like the Pope and Constantinople. I don't really get into those little spats, but I will get into in the next video the Great Schism and all the stuff that led up to it and caused it, and the reverberations that came out of it. Ultimately, humanism, Reformation, Renaissance, Enlightenment, industrialization. I don't really want to talk about industrialization, but all those other things are the proverbial gunshot to both Christian civilization and Roman civilization that befell the West. So yeah, I will have to make several more videos because obviously this is already kind of long, but I plan to do that. I want to actually talk about them with enough detail, not just ramble on. So yeah, I will get to that soon. Hope you liked this video. Hope it was a little understanding to follow and it didn't just seem like I was rambling. I gave it some structure, but I'll put more structure, I guess, more emphasis on details and facts, or I guess I can pull more information from actual sources rather than just like the small set of sources that I used. All right, bye.